in the consultant checklist an item that needed to be revisited. As we mentioned, the resubmissions are all due by November 15th, and we just wanted to provide some additional support for some items that we saw that we would like to develop additional content for you to be able to submit on 11/15 with some items that can be reviewed by our team.
All right, so the first of these items that we're going to take a look at this morning is item B1. And I'll just say that for the next couple of slides, the items here that we're going to look at are things that through the course of the team's initial review, we've kind of seen as challenges for a majority of SAUs that we've reviewed items for to date. So the hope this morning is to just kind of address these in one fell swoop, answer any questions folks may have, and set everybody kind of on the correct course here to correct any areas where they may receive a finding or corrective action for the items that they've submitted. So again, the first of these is item B1, which has to do with required stakeholder engagement as part of the ESEA application development process. So you'll see here, there's the question from the monitoring tool, which basically is, does the SAU consult with all of the required stakeholder groups as part of its ESEA funding application? Some key considerations for this item is that this is a statutory requirement that essentially applies to any SAU that receives ESEA funding. It is a requirement that is synonymous across all of our titles. So if you get funding from any or all ESEA programs, this is something that you would need to respond to as part of fall monitoring. I think one of the biggest things that we've seen from a majority of school districts is that most folks are doing this, but the extent to which they're doing it may be limited to staff within the SAU, or they might be missing a particular stakeholder group, or they may be referring to their public comment period for their ESEA application as their consultation process. So a couple of things with that. First and foremost, when we're talking about consulting with stakeholder groups, every group needs to be consulted in some way, shape, or form. Predominantly, that's going to be your teachers, your building principals, parents of students enrolled in the school, and in some instances, students themselves. So those are the key groups that we want to make sure folks are consulting with. If you don't consult with all those groups to date or aren't able to demonstrate that you've done so, there'll likely be a required corrective action within your monitoring tool related to that. As it relates to public comment period, I just want to clarify that for our purposes, that does not constitute consultation on the application. Really, the public comment period is a means by which you gain kind of final thoughts, impressions, etc., from the public on the SAU's, what I'm going to say, final draft application looks like, or their final intent as to what they plan to spend their funds on. Really, this consultation process is meant to take place before that as part of your initial planning process, particularly when you're thinking of moving funding between titles, etc. So again, one of the big takeaways here for this item is that we need to make sure that we're covering all of our groups, and that probably just as important, we have adequate documentation that we've done that work. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So when we talk about appropriate documentation to demonstrate this work's been done, there's a couple of different ways this can be done. So within the tool itself, we have a couple of suggestions for things folks might be able to submit. I'm just going to kind of reiterate a couple of them here. If kind of as part of your annual data collection process, you have any sort of surveys that go out to, say, staff about, what their professional development or other needs might be. If you do any sort of school climate surveys to students and or parents, those would also be good things to be able to demonstrate that you're getting feedback and input from your stakeholders as to what their needs are, and then mapping kind of some of your ESEA funds to help address those needs. Meetings with individual groups is another great way to demonstrate that you're meeting the requirements of statute. If you do end up using meeting minutes as part of your documentation, there's a couple of things to be mindful of. The first is that that agenda or the minutes from that agenda should state somewhere on it that there's discussion of the ESEA application. Again, sometimes we'll get minutes or agendas or things like that which don't demonstrate that, which make it hard to use as, supporting documentation for the actual item itself. The other key thing to be cognizant of is that when you have your minutes or your agenda, we need participant information with that. So we need to know who was there, what stakeholder group they represent, etc. Oftentimes we'll get something like, a number of people's first and last name or just first names. But on our end, there's no real way of determining who those individuals are, what stakeholder group they represent, etc. So that's just something that we need to have clearly articulated in the documentation you provide, so that we can kind of ensure that the school district is meeting the intent of the law. And then the last possible option here is, let's say, for example, you've done your process this past year, but maybe you don't have clear evidence or documentation that you consulted with parents or students or whatever stakeholder group it might be. What we would ask for from you in that instance is basically what your plan is to rectify that. So that might be a written plan and timeline as to how you're going to change your process moving forward to incorporate that missing group or those missing groups as part of your annual consultation process. So I know I rattled a lot of information off right there. I'll take a minute to pause here and see if there are any questions from folks. I did see one hand pop up while I was going through content here, so I'm happy to pause and take a few questions before we move on.
Travis Mitchell, look here, I have a question.
Go ahead, Mitch.
Yeah, it says in the what you got here, what we're seeing, that students and parents are required, but yet you mentioned something about, and I'm not sure your exact word, but it made it sound like student input wasn't required. It was like, I think you used in some cases. So what is it? Is it required, or in some cases, or what is it?
Yep. So by and large, it's required, but there are kind of situations where it may be more difficult for you to actually do that. So let's say, for example, and I don't think this would be your case, Mitch, but let's say you're a school district that only has like a K-4 building or something like that. It may be hard to get meaningful feedback from students that are that young, in which case we might be able to just kind of certify what we need on our end if you can provide evidence of feedback from parents, because that would kind of serve a dual purpose in that regard. But if, for example, you're an SAU that serves students in like middle or high school, we would expect some level of data collection and feedback from students, because they would be essentially old enough at that point to provide the type of feedback that we would want for that consultation.
Okay, thank you.
All right, good morning again, everybody. One of the items that we also noticed that needed some more clarification was B8, which is the Title I-A and the Title III parent guardian notification for multilingual students and their status. When it comes to this particular item, one thing that folks really need to remember, this doesn't mean you only have to complete this item if you receive Title III funding. This applies for any SAU that receives Title I funding and has at least one multilingual learner in the district. So that was kind of a big thing that we noticed. Some districts were quick to say, oh, this doesn't apply to us because we don't receive Title III funds. So this does stretch across both Title I and Title III. So again, some of the key considerations is that the letter needs to include all the statutory requirements, not just some of them. We saw a lot of letters that included that were really well done, except they were just missing one or two things that may or may not have been clear or clearly defined previously. So we want to make sure that everyone is up to speed on all the statutory requirements. And then the letters need to be personalized and on district letterhead. It can't just be a report that's printed out from a program such as Elevation. So I just wanted to go through the statutory requirements because I think a lot of folks understand some of them, but not necessarily all of them, or there are key pieces missing from particular requirements. So the first one is the reasons for the identification of a child as an English learner and in need of placement in a language instruction program. Again, I think this is one of the universal things that folks were really good about, identifying that, you know, a screener was done after a home language survey, and then, you know, the score was the composite score was less than 4.5, which would indicate that the student would need services. So that one was perfectly fine overall. The child's level of English proficiency, again, was something that a lot of folks had. How it was assessed. The piece on this one that folks particularly might have forgot about is the status of the child's academic achievement. So this is something that needs to be included as well. So I think just like you would pull achievement levels for any other student, you want to make sure you pull those for multilingual students as well and include that on the letter. The next piece, methods of instruction that are used. I think a lot of folks were okay with the methods of instruction. They were able to articulate that. The piece that was missing was how the programs and their instructional goals and the use of English and a native language in instruction was going to happen. So I think a lot of this was just needing a little more detail on these particular elements and how the program that the child is enrolled in will meet the educational strengths and needs of that particular child. So again, I think when we look at some of these letters and a lot of the information, it does need to be more personalized. And I understand that, you know, that could be a little more time consuming and tedious, but there are ways to kind of help expedite the process while still having it personalized. The next part of statutory requirements, how the program will help the child learn English and meet the age-appropriate academic achievement standards. Again, I think some of this was included around the learning English and meeting the ELP standards. It was more about the academic achievement standards that were missing in the narrative around that piece. Specific exit requirements. I think a lot of folks were really good on this piece. The one thing that I did want to mention on this in particular is the expected rate of transition from the program. So if a student is entering or if they're identified as a multilingual learner, how many years is expected before they exit? That information needs to be provided as well. And the last couple requirements that are needed. So in the event that a child is both a multilingual learner and has an IEP or, you know, is a child with a disability, that needs to be laid out as well. So those, you need to be able to describe how the program meets the objectives of the IEP of the child. And then the information pertaining to parents' rights. There's 3 bullets here. The one that applies to everybody is detailing the right parents have to have their child immediately removed from the program upon their request. So that's one that needs to be included. The other 2 bullets on this one, I don't think necessarily applies to any district in the state, as it relates to a district that has more than one type of programming for multilingual learners. So if your district does have more than one type of programming, that needs to be explained to parents, and you need to be able to provide assistance in helping them make the choice as to which one's going to be most beneficial for their student. So those are the statutory requirements when it comes to these notifications. It does lengthen the letters that need to be going home, but we want to make sure that everyone is doing doing what's required, because we want to make sure that everyone is on board and making sure that we're doing everything that we're supposed to be doing.
Danielle, there was a question in the chat box in regards to potentially having an exemplar for a letter that has all the statutory requirements, and if that might be available or sample would be helpful.
I think it's hard to have an exemplar in this case because the letters are personalized. I mean, I'm happy to work with the district if they have a particular letter that they would like to kind of go over with me, and we can kind of identify which pieces they have and which pieces they might still need. So I'm happy to do that kind of on a one-on-one basis with districts. So feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to work with you. So when we talk about this item in particular, when we're looking at supporting documentation, so copy of an actual letter that was sent out, that's signed, dated on district letterhead, and in a language that families can understand, as well as a copy of the letter in English, obviously for statutory review, would need to be provided as well. When it comes to, actually, let me pause for a moment. Are there any other questions related to B8 before I move on to B9?
There's a question chat from Jenny Darrigan. The state has an ILAP template. Would we be able to add these details into that document for guidance?
I'd have to take a look at that, Jenny, because obviously the ILAP doesn't necessarily replace the parent notification. So we can definitely look at that, and we can see about if there's a way to pull some of that information from the ILAP and making sure that it does, get included to letters if there are pieces that meet those requirements.
Thank you.
Keith here, just not seeing my raise my hand thing this morning, so just a general question. So there are a lot of requirements that were just listed, and it seems as though I understand the specificity with regard to the student's achievement level is unique. But I'm trying to figure out why we would not have some type of sample letter available to us with all, it seems like you've just listed off a ton of requirements.
Yep.
That would be, so this personalized letter seems to have extended itself to like 5 pages long.
Yeah, and Keith, I definitely appreciate the question. This is the first year that we've been reviewing this particular item. And so an exemplar hasn't been generated at this point. It's something that I can try and work on to make sure that, there is some sort of high-level template that districts can obviously customize based on their students. But I can certainly try to put something together that touches on those requirements.
It would just make sense if a student is moving district to district to be able to communicate consistently with families. If, you're working with one district, Daniel, maybe, removing a student's name or any other identifying information might be helpful to place on the DOE's website as an example.
Yeah, I mean, we can definitely look into doing something like that, Keith, because obviously we want to provide as many resources as possible to make this less burdensome. All right, we also wanted to go into B9. This is the Title I and Title III multilingual learner parent guardian outreach. I think on this one of the biggest things that folks may have overlooked is the feedback piece of this. I think a lot of folks were really great about providing, opportunities that they've offered to multilingual families. But just remembering that, again, any district that receives Title I and has at least one multilingual learner, this definitely applies for. So again, the collecting and responding to feedback was the piece that we noticed overall that was missing. So we want to make sure that we clarified this a little bit more for folks. So when we look for appropriate documentation, so we're looking for, meeting sign-in sheets or agendas, a copy of a feedback form if one was used that was kind of standardized. And if there wasn't a form that was standardized and it was more informal, providing a narrative describing the process that includes, questions that may have been asked of families, and then the feedback or the responses that were provided from the families, and then a narrative of how the district then responded to that feedback. So again, really, when we look at this particular outreach, it's more about the interactions with families and allowing feedback, and then how the district is responding to that feedback that we're looking for.
Before we move on from B9, the parent outreach, is there any questions associated with this item?
Okay, E8, Title I-A supplement, not supplant. This one is talking about making sure that you are not decreasing your local state funds at Title I schools just because you receive Title I money at those schools. So big key considerations are if you are a Title I neutral school or you are giving money to all the schools at a certain grade level, we can't make that comparison, so you are exempt from this. Or if you're Title I exempt, which would mean that you are a one school district, you only have one school building per grade level, then again, we can't do that comparison work. So you would be exempt from this requirement. This one can be tricky because budgets are very complicated. And I just want to iterate that we are just looking for a way to compare how much you're spending. So sometimes we've been getting like trial balances of all of the minutia of spending at each individual school. We're not looking for that level of detail. We're looking, if you would provide something like that, you'd want to highlight and show what we should be looking at to compare that you're equally funding staffing or supplies or whatever pieces align with the process that is written in your application. for any school that this applies to in your ESEA application, you already have written out a supplement not supplant description. So we're just looking for some documentation that matches that description. Let's see. Yes, so I will provide an example on the next slide. This one's a little tricky because it really depends on how you budget locally. I'd say like per pupil budgeting is kind of easy. That's the example I've shown you, but there's some who budget with equity and things like that. So however you have your description written for how you budget locally, again, you're just looking for documentation that showcases that process and shows that you're not lowering your funds for Title I schools. So here's one example of per pupil. So thank you, South Portland, for letting me share this because I thought it was really great. So they just gave a basic narrative explaining that they have a neutral process, doesn't consider Title I funds. Their description in the application is much more detailed. So I used that to just kind of learn more about the overall process. And then you can see the documentation that they provided is just a really great broken down version of, in that first column, you can see the total local funding, excluding special ed students, the projected enrollment, and then the per pupil amount at each school. The ones highlighted in blue are Title I, and you can see they are not below the non-Title I schools, so they are good to go. So hopefully that's a clearer example, but again, it depends on your local budgeting process. So if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me, and I would be happy to work through and try to talk through ways you can share evidence.
And one thing around this, I think too, that Jess has mentioned before is how important the narrative is. So, for some of the items, you can send the evidence, right? And it's pretty self-explanatory. Maybe you add a comment about how you disseminate that information at the start of the year, for instance. But for this item, I would say an understanding a narrative that really does explain the budgeting process, how the district looks at each of the schools. Is it per pupil? What district, maybe certain district programs live in certain schools, and to explain sort of how that budgeting process happens. That really then takes the spreadsheets or the other evidence that you provide and really makes it much clearer what's going on at the district level. So just a little plug in for a narrative there.
So we pulled out all the items that we felt we wanted to provide some additional support with in regards to monitoring for FY25. We're going to stop sharing our screen and open it up for any additional questions that